Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janner for Card Runners, and I'm here with the Theory of Preflop Play Part 2. This is the second installment in my updated version of the Theory of Preflop Play. So we're going to be continuing where we left off, but before we do, I just want to give you a quick overview of what we'll be discussing in this video. We will finish up discussing flatting 3-bets in position. We're going to put extra emphasis on when slow playing makes theoretical sense, since this isn't something I've talked about very much before. So we're going to focus a little bit more on that than we otherwise would. We're also going to talk about 5-bet jamming and flatting 4-bets out of position. This is not one I'm particularly looking forward to, but a lot of people have asked about how to defend against 4-bets out of position, so we'll go into detail on that. We'll discuss the theory and logic behind playing big pots preflop. We're also going to discuss cold calling preflop. Explain how we pick what hands go into our cold calling range based on stack depth and position, as well as how multi-way we think the pot will be. So we're going to focus on those three kind of key variables for designing cold calling ranges. Then we're going to design defending ranges against a cutoff open. We're going to try to get as close as we can to an optimal defending range from each position. So given the cutoff opens, we'll talk about how should the button 3-bet and flat, how should the small blind 3-bet and flat, how should the big blind 3-bet and flat. So that'll be something we'll do, and we'll also use parameters to see if our ranges look reasonable. Since we can't solve for this, parameters are very, very useful for telling us if we're doing something wrong, if we're folding too much, if we're 3-betting too much, something like that. So we'll use parameters to check the range to make sure it looks reasonable. Hopefully we'll be able to cover all this in this video. If not, it'll get pushed to another video. Why we should not insta-4-bet all our great hands. We must always take the most plus EV line with every hand in our range in theory. What happens if we just 4-bet all our strong hands? Our opponent will overall be able to barrel us aggressively, especially on boards which miss our range, 9 high and lower. So, if we face a 3-bet and we're in position and we just 4-bet all of our really, really good hands, there's a good amount of board textures that we pretty much just completely whiff. It might be a king high flop, and it might be a 9 high or lower flop. We just don't really hit those boards no matter what our range is. So it's especially common if someone like opens the cutoff, gets 3-bet from the small blind, and that player in the cutoff 4-bets all of their ace, king, queens, kings, and aces, because then they just completely whiff king high flops and 9 high flops. This gives us an incentive to start slow playing our big hands. So since our opponent will know we start missing certain boards, he'll start barreling very, very aggressively, which gives us an incentive to call with our strong hands preflop, because we're going to get paid so well. Eventually, an equilibrium is reached where we are slow playing some big hands and fast playing others. Our opponent can barrel aggressively, but not so aggressively we should never 4-bet anything strong. So this is something that really confused me for a long time, because the rule that probably sort of helped me more than any other rule when I was learning how to play poker, and I know I've talked about this a lot, it was the rule that said, raise your best hands for value, call with your next best hands, bluff raise your next best, and fold your worst. Now that implies you can rank all your hands from strongest to weakest, which sometimes is going to be more reasonable than others, and it has a lot of problems with that rule, but overall that rule was very, very helpful to me. Once I started doing that, you start noticing the cold calling ranges preflop when you're defending against 3-bets, they start to get probably too weak. They start to get to the point where your opponent can just barrel extremely aggressively. One thing you've probably noticed from actually playing cards, if you're playing, most reasonable limits, is when you 3-bet and your opponent calls, you're probably going to be able to c-bet any 2 cards on a whole lot of flops really, really profitably because your opponent doesn't have many strong hands in his range. There's other things going on as well, and it doesn't imply there's necessarily a problem if you can 3-bet any 2 cards profitably, but for the most part, or at least some of the reason why you're able to do it, is because people are not slow playing big hands when they should be. We are not slow playing some strong hands for the sake of balance. We are doing it because the opponent barrels so aggressively that it happens to be the most plus EV line in a vacuum with a specific hand. If it makes other hands in our range more plus EV, that's just some happy poker range splash damage, which is a StarCraft 2 nerd reference. So a lot of people, they think the reason why you balance is because, when you balance it makes other hands more profitable. That's not actually what happens from a theoretical perspective. Every single hand you play has to be taking the most plus EV line at every single point. So if it does happen to make your other hands play better, that's just some nice splash damage that just happens to work out. So here, if we're slow playing a really strong hand when we're in position, as we'll go into more detail in a minute, it makes it harder for the opponent to barrel us really aggressively. So that might make sort of our marginal hands more profitable, because now our opponent says, well, wait a second, I can't barrel super aggressively into Matt, because Matt's not just insta-4-betting all of his ace, king, kings, and aces. He's calling some, which makes it harder to barrel. So that makes our other hands better, but that's not the reason why we're slow playing. Which hands make the most sense to flat? What are we looking for when we call with a very strong hand? Well, we don't want the hand to be vulnerable to being outdrawn on many flops. We can probably raise on the flop or turn as necessary if our hand looks vulnerable. So that's something that's very important to keep in mind, is your opponent's not going to get to realize all the equity of his hand. So if we slow play a really strong hand and we get a flop that's like 8 of spades, 7 of spades, 5 of hearts, and we're just like, ooh, that is not a board where I want to see a lot of turn cards, we can just start raising now. We are aware that that's a very drawy board, so we can raise earlier on, so our opponent doesn't get to realize all the equity for his, pairs plus gut shots and stuff like that without putting a whole ton of money in the pot. When the board's King 2-2 Rainbow, we can say, oh, we don't need to raise anything there because King 2-2 Rainbow, no big deal if he sees another card. We want it to be strong on board textures that might otherwise miss our range relative to the opponent's. So I just talked about this. It's nice to actually have some strong hands on 9 high flops. Our range is still going to completely suck on a 9 high flop, but it will be better and it's nice. If we can have some cool removal effects, then that's just icing on the cake. Removal effects tend to be overrated in general as ranges are wide, but as ranges get really, really narrow, they start to be really, really awesome. So for example, blocking the nut flush on the river, that's a huge deal. Removing an ace pre-flop, it's nice, but it's not really anything I'm going to go out of my way for. Alright, so clips. I am a huge advocate of slow playing ace-ace on the button when a good player in the blinds 3-bets. That's by far the most common spot you're going to find yourself in, opening on the button and getting 3-bet. It does everything I want a hand to do. King is also pretty good at this and can be used as necessary. So think about aces when you're on the button and the blinds 3-bet you. Because I believe that if you open the button with pocket aces, in theory, you should flat all of those combos when you get 3-bet. Not just some once in a while to mix it up. I think you should flat all of them. The hand's not vulnerable on the flop, especially against the 3-bet from the blinds. Maybe once in a rare while, the big blind or the small blind will 3-bet a pocket pair and then they'll drill a set. But other than that, it's just so rare you're actually behind on the flop. It's really, really good on the board textures that otherwise whiff us. Like, we can't really hit 8 and 9 high boards without slow playing some overpairs. If you think, well, wait a second, I'll start calling with more suited connectors. Flopping top pair with no kicker on an 8 or 9 high board, that is not that good when the opponent's 3-betting range is polarized to like aces, kings, queens, and jacks and 10s. So really the only way to hit those is by slow playing aces. And then it also just happens to have awesome removal effects. So because it has every single variable in its favor, I think you should slow play every single pocket aces when you open them on the button and the blinds 3-bet you. Can I prove it? Nope. So take it for what it's worth, but I think in this spot, you want to call with all your aces. As you get into other positions, then it might become more debatable. And especially in practice, look at your opponent. If he's a nit, obviously always 4-bet him if you think you can get paid. So you stack his ace-king or, his pocket queens now. But in theory, calling with aces is going to be pretty awesome. So now let's make that range. So I've made quickies before about how the wider you open in the button, the more you're going to have to defend, and how once you start using very wide button opening ranges, you basically just have to start defending crazy wide to 3-bets in position. That's something that I don't want to just repeat again in this video, and it's one of those things where, especially in practice, you're probably going to be able to open the button much wider than you theoretically should be able to, because it's much harder for the opponent to donk bet out of position, check raise aggressively, 3-bet aggressively, than it is for you to sort of just abuse him in position. And if only one of the blinds is good and the other blind is just mediocre, you can still open way wider. So I don't really want to repeat all that again. So what I'm going to do is just go over sort of the order of hands I would use, and how many hands you need to use will depend on how wide your button opening range is. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk briefly about the 4-betting range. Pretty much, I'm just a fan of 4-betting these guys right here. You maybe can even slow play an ace-king if you want. I probably wouldn't unless I had a really good reason for it. But for the most part, if the opponent's 3-betting us, they're going to be 3-betting us with a polarized range that's 10s and better, and ace-queen and ace-king. So the hands that work well as 4-bets are the hands that are sort of strong and can get it in now, yet vulnerable. So queens are a great example of that. You feel pretty okay getting it in. If your opponent flats your 4-bet and you have queens or kings, that's fine too. So these hands, I think, you're going to usually want to 4-bet. And then ace-king is a special type of hand, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But even though ace-king is awesome, it's kind of weird in the fact that it blocks the hands that beat it, but it's still very, very strong, yet it's also very vulnerable to being outdrawn by the opponent's bluffs. Like, even if your opponent's 3-bet bluffing with 7-5 suited, he's going to outdraw your ace-king all the time. So ace-king's a hand where it's like, I really just want to put a lot of money in the pot now. If you 3-bet bluffed and I make you fold your 3-bet bluff, that's totally fine. So this is usually what my 4-betting range is going to look like, or I should say the value component of my 4-betting range. And then you just add in the appropriate number of bluffs with the right removal effects for whatever tickles your fancy to balance out the range. So this will maybe get your 4-bet to around 3.3%. That's very, very low. Most people 4-bet much more than this because most people think, oh man, I have, pocket jacks. I can get it in profitably, so I should 4-bet. When they're not really thinking if it's actually better than calling, and a lot of times calling will be better. So if the opponent has polarized by his 3-betting range, we're mostly going to want to call and take a flop in position rather than 4-betting, hence this tiny, tiny range. All right, so let's talk about hands in the calling range. So I already talked about how aces are just awesome, and jacks, I think, are also usually going to be a call, because even though you can get it in against tens, we'll talk more about that later, it's not probably good enough to justify the 4-bet, in my opinion. I think you want to call and take the flop in position for a 3-bet pot. So these two are pretty easily clearly the best hands to call with here. Obviously, aces don't really count since we're slow playing it. And then after that, you're going to want to start calling with hands like ace-queen. Even though your opponent should expect you to hit a lot of queen-high flops, they just play so incredibly well. They tell you whether or not you have the best hand, usually. They can outkick stuff your opponent has a lot. Then next, I would say, is probably like king-queen suited. Then, after that, ace-jack suited. Then maybe ace-10 suited. Pocket 10s are probably a little better than the ace-10 suited. Then pocket 10s, ace-10 suited. King-jack suited. Queen-jack suited. Nines. So nines, we'll talk about hands like this more in a bit, but nines, in my opinion, don't actually play all that well in 3-bet pots, which is why I like the high suited cards a little bit more, though it's pretty debatable. Then you also can start adding in hands like king, queen off, jack 10 suited, ace jack off. Which one do I want? 10-9 suited. See, and these aren't really a big deal. I'm just trying to give you a general order. Then like maybe 9-8 suited, pocket 8, king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, king jack off, ace 10 off, 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited, queen jack off, ace 9 suited, pocket 7s, pocket 6s. Once again, not feeling all that passionate. Actually, before these hands, jack 9 suited is probably a little bit better. And then, so as we just have to add, and you'll find if you're opening the button like 50 or 60%, you're going to have to defend crazy wide if your opponent's 3-betting. And that could theoretically be correct. We can't really prove it, although my guess is it's not. And as you want to add more hands in this, you probably start adding in like 6-5 suited, 10-8 suited, king 9 suited, queen 9 suited, ace 8 suited, 9-7 suited, 8-6 suited, 7-5 suited, pocket 5s, 5-4 suited, 6-4 suited, pocket 4s. You might even then you start adding in like suited aces, stuff like this. And heads-up ranges, if you've ever seen what heads-up ranges look like for actual heads-up play pre-flop, so 2 players pre-flop, then you get crazy, crazy wide ranges, much, much wider than this. So yeah, this should give you an idea to get you up to 20% defending, but something like that. And then for a normal, unknown kind of standard range, what range you're going to want to play is really going to depend on your stakes. So I almost don't even want to give one, but the kind of hands that I'm pretty much always calling with are going to be stuff like this. Like, you have to give me a reason really not to call with a hand like one of these. I'm pretty much always going to call with those, and then as I need to widen my range as I get a read, I'm going to make this range significantly wider, because theoretically you're never going to be able to fold hands like this. You're going to have to call them. Alright, so hopefully that gives you a rough idea. And once again, if you want more specific ranges for how to defend the button against a 3-bet, then check out my quickies on that specific topic, which will tell you how wide you need to defend. But just be sure to watch the theory patch before you do watch those, because those are the videos that made me really release the theory patch, because I messed up on the math with them. Alright, so let's quickly review what we've covered so far. I'm going to go over this really fast. We showed how in theory the opener should be indifferent to opening the worst hand in his range. We showed how to design 3-betting ranges and 3-bet calling ranges. An opening range would be designed through a mix of theory and trial and error for what hand is profitable. Remember, theory is going to suck at solving this problem since we have a jillion possible actions and ranges and flops we can play against. Trial and error works best here. Theory can be applied later to make the range even better, for example by checking to make sure it doesn't need to defend crap to a 3-bet. It's time to move on to 4-betting and 5-betting ranges, but to be honest, it's more or less the same thing. In fact, a lot of post-flop play is more or less the same thing as pre-flop play. It's just harder since we have to evaluate board textures, and we actually can make a lot more useful parameters since ranges are more polarized. So post-flop play is way, way harder than pre-flop play, but a lot of the same concepts we used here we're going to use again, which is why it's so important to really understand pre-flop play. The 5-bet jam. In general, hands which 5-bet usually have between 25 to 33% equity depending on the positions. Pocket fives has 33.2% equity versus a range of jacks and better and ace-king. Pocket fives has 27.5% equity versus a range of kings and better and ace-king suited. That's a pretty big jump. Set up an algebraic equation to figure out how frequently your 5-bet jam needs to work. Let's say a 3BB open in the small blind, big blind 3 bets to 9 big blind, small blind 4 bets to 22 big blinds, and the big blind jams with a hand that has 30% equity when called. Pause and do it. Getting good at poker requires you to do stuff that isn't fun for everyone. So some people like doing this kind of math, some people hate it. It's very, very important if you want to get better. So I would pause and do the math for this. I know I talked really fast the last 2 slides to try to cover a lot of ground. So just pause. If you're not really comfortable with this, read this on your own, read it slowly, and then try to work out the math. Then unpause it in just a sec. Okay. So the 5-bet jams 91 big blinds to win 34 big blinds. When the jam works, the big blind wins 34 big blind because that's all the dead money in the pot. When the jam fails, the big blind has 30% times 200 BB equals 60 big blind in equity, so he only loses on average 31 big blind when he's called. So that's kind of the key step here. You have to remember, when you're going all in, you get to realize your equity. You know, that's not the case if you're 5-betting and you're very, very deep. You don't necessarily get to realize your equity. Here, when you 5-bet, you're getting to realize all your equity. So that's going to drastically change the math for this. Because now when your jam fails, you're on average only going to lose 31 big blind. You know, that's a lot different than if someone could 5-bet for 1,000 big, or 6-bet for 1,000 big blinds and make you fold and lose 100 big blinds. So the math. You win 34 big blinds X fraction of the time when your opponent folds, and you lose 31 1 minus X. So that will add up to make his calling frequency. That will equal 0. So X equals 47.7%. So the opponent needs to fold 47.7% when you are jamming the 5-bet of 5s to make it profitable. So your jam needs to work less than half the time and it's profitable here, which is why 3-bet 5-betting from the blinds could be so awesome, especially with pocket pairs. Win to 5-bet jam. The 5-bet jam is pretty sweet, especially exploitatively, as people tend to think it needs to work way more than it does. He's risking 91 big blinds to win 34 big blinds. I can fold a ton here. Tends to be people's thought process without realizing that since you are guaranteed to realize the equity on your hand, it doesn't need to work nearly this often. Another thing that's very, very important to keep in mind is almost all the theory that I've ever done, one thing I learned for how people play compared to how theory suggests people should play is people tend to love the easier line. So if you're 3-betting someone really aggressively from the blinds, like you should be doing, and it might just be that you got dealt a bunch of really good hands and a bunch of really good randomizers from the blinds, so you just 3-bet those because you're playing close to optimal, and that's how it works. Well, when you're 3-betting someone like crazy, when they're in the button, a lot of times people are going to respond by 4-betting because that's easier. When they 4-bet, they just go, oh, well, you know what? My opponent's not going to flat 4-bets out of position. I can 4-bet here. If he jams, I'll just fold. And then if my opponent's 3-betting a lot, he's going to have to fold to my 4-bet. They don't respond by calling your 3-bets maybe as much as they should because that's harder. They don't know what to do with 9-jack suited post-flop, whereas they know how to just 4-bet and fold. So just keep that in mind. This can be really effective against the right types of players. In theory, 5-bet should probably happen significantly less often than they do. They're fine rarely, but 4-betting range is already so polarized that should be pretty uncommon. Remember when I just said how in the button, I would only 4-bet kings, queens, ace, king for value? So if I'm only 4-betting those for value, you can imagine how incredibly small the 5-betting range is. Like super, super small. So in practice, this is happening way, way more often than it should because people just want to take the easier line and they don't understand the math. But in theory, you should not be just seeing 4-bets and 5-bets pre-flop all the time. They should be quite rare. Yet people usually pick a 4-bet sizing way too big, which often makes 5-bet jamming better and calling less desirable. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Remember, 95% of the time theory is a tool to help you exploit players better. The value in knowing this stuff isn't to memorize ranges in autopilots, it's to be able to exploit players who are too lazy to learn it. So now after you've seen this math, you can say, oh wow, my 5-bet needs to work less than half the time for it to be profitable. If your opponent's making big 4-bets, it might even be significantly less than that. If that's the case, you can use that exploitatively to just think, oh, I don't know if my opponent's going to be able to call here half the time. Go ahead and 5-bet a ton if it's working for you, even if you're way too weighted towards value or air. I'm sure different stuff works at different stakes. So I don't know when you should be weighted too much towards bluffing, too much towards value as sort of like a generic default based on stakes. But if you have a HUD up, you should easily be able to see what opponents you should do what against. Finishing up 5-betting. One cool thing about 5-betting is it allows us to defend more of our 3-bets, which allow us to 3-bet bluff quite aggressively. So that's something to keep in mind. When you're looking at like, okay, how much can I 3-bet? I don't want to fold too much to 4-bets. You have to remember if you're 5-bet jamming your 3-bet that was originally a 3-bet bluff, then that's going to let you 3-bet bluff much more aggressively before your opponent can exploit you by 4-betting. Another neato aspect is how much we can 5-bet bluff will change pretty drastically based on how strong our 5-betting range is. So this is something that I would say I got wrong the first time I made a preflop series. So I believe I understood this when I made the series, but I thought, oh, well, it's not that big of a deal. Let's lump everything together so we can use these frequencies which are easy to memorize. And it is important to have a general sense for how much you can 3-bet bluff and for what frequencies you should use in different spots. That's incredibly important post-flop. You know, most people don't understand how when you raise the river, you need to have value almost always. When you raise the flop, you usually should be bluffing. So general frequencies are very important to memorize, but you don't want to think they're more precise than they are, and that's something I definitely believe I did for the first video. So let's talk about why that's not the case. So if you are 5-betting a range of ace, king, and jacks, we must be careful not to add too many bluffs or else our opponent will be able to call very aggressively. When he calls, he'll usually at least have one overcard out against our value range. Since it is not that devastating when he calls and sees value, he must be seeing value at a high frequency to be indifferent. So imagine you're playing against me, and we're playing preflop kind of the way most people do. So you opened, I 3-bet, you 4-bet, and I 5-bet jam. So you think when you see that 5-bet, you're like, ugh, this sucks. I don't really want to see a 5-bet jam. But if my value range is overall relatively weak, like if my value range is kind of ace, king, jacks, and better, you might have some hands in your range which don't completely hate calling that 5-bet. Like maybe you'll say to yourself, like, okay, well, even when I call the 5-bet, sometimes Matt might have ace, king if you call with pocket tens, in which case we're flipping, you're slightly ahead. Sometimes, you know, you'll have, maybe, you probably wouldn't have ace, queen in your range, but if you did, you'd have 2 overcards against jacks. And even if you have a hand like ace, 9 suited, you might think to yourself, well, if Matt's bluffing, I'm in really good shape if Matt's bluffing a weaker suited ace. And even when you call and you are, you know, behind, but you got a really, really good price, and you almost always have 1 live overcard. So in other words, when you call with a bluff catcher and my value betting range consists of this ace, king, and jack stuff, it's not really that bad. It's bad, but it's not awful because my value 5-bets weren't that awesome. If my 5-betting range is aces and ace 5 suited, it's devastating when you're called and see value. Aces crush everything. So now, if you're facing a 5-bet from me, and you know I either have aces or air, even if I have air a lot, you might say to yourself, I still don't think I can call this, because even when Matt has ace 5 suited, if you call with pocket jacks, I still have a good chance of outdrawing you. Whereas when I have aces and you have jacks, your odds of outdrawing me are very, very, very slim. So what sort of weight of value bets to bluffs you can have within your 5-betting range is going to depend on the quality of the 5-betting value component. So if you're 5-betting pretty much just aces, maybe kings, you can use a lot of air. If you're 5-betting ace, king, and jacks are better, you're not going to be able to use very much air. In other words, 50% of our 5-betting range might be bluffs if we are literally just betting aces and air. We need way more value if we are 5-betting jacks and better and ace, king. So jacks and better and ace, king would make up 40 value combos. Do not add in 40 bluffs. Aces would make up 6 value combos. You likely could add 6 bluffs. When to call 4-bets out of position. So this is something I did not touch in the first video. I just assumed you don't do this, and in theory, you definitely should. Alright, so in theory, we have to have an out-of-position flatting range for both 3-bets and 4-bets. The opponent will just 4-bet smaller and smaller until we do, which forces us to either 5-bet jam super wide or 5-bet jam super small, which can then result in us playing a 5-bet pot out of position. So basically, there's not really a way to get out around having a flatting range against 3-bets and 4-bets when you're out of position. If you do, your opponent will just make his sizing really, really small, and then if you decide to 4-bet or 5-bet, they get an option to flat, or they get an option to go all in. You know, they'd probably only go all in if you 5-bet, but they get an option to go all in which case, you know, now you've invested even more money, so if you fold, you've lost a bigger pot. If a good player is 4-betting small and using a very balanced range, we will have to start flatting out of position. I pretty much just said that. So hands like ace-queen, ace-king, jacks to queens, all can make sense depending on positions. Remember, the opponent's 5-bet calling range is super strong, so these hands won't often be great. So think about this for a minute, because it feels very weird and it feels very gross, and it is. If I open in the button, and you 3-bet me in the small blind, you're going to want to 3-bet with hands like pocket jacks, pocket queens, ace-king, ace-queen, because you know when I flat your 3-bet, and I'm usually going to defend by flatting, those hands are going to do really, really well. But if I 4-bet you, especially if I 4-bet small, with a range of queens, kings, and ace-king, what does 5-betting with these hands really accomplish? If you 5-bet jam jacks or queens, I'm just going to call you with queens, kings, and ace-king. Queens do not do well against that range. Jacks do not do well against this range. So it really forces you to see like, oh gosh, I have to be calling here because my opponent's range is so polarized. 5-betting doesn't really make a lot of sense. All 5-betting does is it prevents your opponent from realizing the equity on his bluffs. That's nice. The problem is if I start 4-betting very, very small in position, now you're having to make these massive 5-bets. And then if you make these massive 5-bets, that's not really very effective. Or if you make if you go all in, you get to realize your equity at least. Whereas if you make your really, really small 5-bet, now I can just flat your 5-bet in position if I want, and you're not guaranteed to get to realize the equity on your hand. So there's really just not a good option here. The best option is probably to start flatting the 4-bet. We can slow play pocket aces, but having a capped range when the pot is already 40 big blinds and there is 80 big blinds behind isn't a huge deal. Really, what can he do? So I don't really have a problem with slow playing aces when facing a 4-bet. You can maybe say it's very similar, and in a lot of ways it will be, to facing a 3-bet. But the difference is having a capped range when there's already 40 big blinds in the pot and there's 80 big blinds behind, it's not really going to matter all that much. There's already a lot more dead money. So, if you're capped and there's a lot of streets left to act and a lot of stack depth, that's usually going to be really, really bad. Here, if we're defending against a 4-bet with a range of ace-queen, ace-king, jacks, and queens, so let's say we don't have any, pocket aces or pocket kings in our range, what can the opponent really do? If the board comes low, we're going to stack off jacks and queens because we have to. We don't have anything better. If the board comes high, we're going to have, ace-queen and ace-king, which could have hit it. If we're cord, if the board comes king high and the opponent has pocket aces, we're just losing. There's nothing we can do. So being capped here isn't that big of a deal. You could argue that you should flat a really strong hand when you're facing a 4-bet, even if you're out of position. But for the most part, I imagine people are going to want to 5-bet it. Alright, so ace-king is kind of weird since it blocks the hands it does poorly against and hates giving free flops. Bluffs which much more likely suck out on ace-king than queens or kings. I don't think it is worth going too into detail about one hand, but understand why this hand is weird when making decisions. So, hands like ace-queen, jacks, and queens, for the example I gave earlier, I imagine people don't really have much of a problem with seeing like, oh, it makes sense how if you're playing against someone that knows what they're doing, you have to flat the 4-bet out of position with them if your opponent's only 4-betting, better hands or bluffs. Ace-king is kind of in its own little territory, because it blocks the hands that it loses against, and if I have pocket queens and my opponent 4-bet bluffed 7-9 suited, queens aren't really going to get outdrawn. 7-9 suited just doesn't really bust pocket queens very often. But if I have ace-king and my opponent 4-bet 7-9 suited, that hand's going to get outdrawn all the time. So, ace-king is very different than the other hands, which is why it can make sense to just 5-bet ace-king and be like, you know what, if you have me beat, you have me beat. I'm fine with making you fold your bluffs. I don't want to let you have a free flop. That I think makes a lot of sense. So, for the most part, I probably would take the option of 5-betting ace-king compared to flatting a 4-bet out of position, especially if it was like button versus small blind type of stuff. In other spots, maybe that's not the case. In other spots, if the opponent's range, 4-betting range is so strong, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you do. Ace-king's tough. You could talk about it a whole lot, but understand why it's weird when you're making your decision. When to call 4-bets out of position continued. Out of position 4-bet flatting ranges are very hard to play. It is worth considering just 5-betting or folding if you're not a post-flop boss and your opponents aren't going to crush your soul for this. So this is actually something that matters a lot to me, because if you've been around poker for several years, even if you weren't playing seriously several years ago, you probably remember how back in the day, people used to think flatting 3-bets or 4-bets out of position was something only fish do. It's terrible, it's awful, if you do that, you're a fish. And the reason for it is probably for 2 reasons. The first is it's extremely hard to play these ranges. And the second is once enough people start saying stuff, and this is something for the whole human species, not poker, once enough people start saying stuff, it tends to be that other people start believing it because they're like, oh, well, this person who I respect said it, so then they start saying it, and then other people start hearing it, and they start saying it. So everyone just kind of keeps repeating it, which is definitely what happened here, and definitely why I kind of got suckered in for it when I made this first pre-flop series. So I agree these ranges are very, very hard to play, but a lot of the reason why you probably feel like they're gross, they're bad, is because everyone's told you they're bad, not so much that actual math and theory supports it, because it really doesn't. Enjoy the fact that most people's bet sizing sucks and they have a pretty easily identifiable leaks. Do not force these ranges into existence if you don't have to, but don't think they don't exist either. Many hands in the 4-bet flatting range are likely to be indifferent to calling or folding preflop in theory, and we should only flat fractions of combos. This is a fun one. So ace-jack suited, king-queen off, 8-7 suited, all may only flat fractions of combos. Alright, so let's use big blind versus button as an example again. Let's imagine I open on the button, you 3-bet me with king-queen off in the big blind, which can make sense because it's a hand that does well against my 3-bet calling range. If I 4-bet and you flat all your king-queen off, that might be a really big problem because that's 12 combos, and your 4-bet flatting range probably isn't that big, so 12 combos make up a huge fraction of that range. So you might need to call some and fold some, which in theory, or just by definition, then means they're both 0 EV. So if you always fold all your king-queen off there, or if you always fold all your ace-jack suited, because these hands are both reasonable 3-bets depending on how wide the button opening range is, that's likely exploitable. If you always defend all of them, that's likely exploitable, so you have to start dealing with fractions of combos, which is a huge pain. Don't ever get caught up with trying to figure out fractions of combos from a theoretical perspective. It's kind of nice to just be able to realize, okay, so this is a spot where in theory I can go either ways. What should I do against this guy? That's by far the best approach. Keep in mind how narrow this range is. A hand like ace-queen can make a huge fraction of the range if we defend all the combos. So king-queen off might not even be the best example there because you might not think it's a 3-bet against a button open. But ace-queen you probably do, and you also might agree it doesn't make a whole lot of sense as a 5-bet. So if you're flatting all your ace-queen or if you're folding them all, it's just going to be exploitable. So you can kind of conclude in theory you should have to split that range between folding and calling, and maybe even between folding, calling, and jamming. And then that's just how stuff gets very tricky and detailed and not all that immediately practical. So now we're going to move on into cold calling preflop. This will be much more practical and much more important than the last few slides about flatting 3-bets and 4-bets out of position. I really only included those because I felt I had to. I wanted to get all the information out there. So cold calling preflop is, in my opinion, the most difficult topic for preflop play for a few reasons. Now, I don't mean it's more difficult to understand at a glance than the last few slides we talked about. I mean it's much more difficult from like a modeling, solving standpoint, a purely theoretical standpoint, as I'll talk about and explain right now. So first is equity is a very complex topic. A high equity hand doesn't have a high expected value necessarily, and a low equity hand doesn't necessarily have a low expected value. This makes it hard to define strength of hands. So since we're preflop, there's a ton of variables left. Are we multi-way? Or, what's going to happen for the rest of preflop? Then what flop do we get? Then once we get a flop, a turn, and a river, there's still 3 rounds of betting with a whole ton of stack depth. All those variables really mean equity and expected value aren't as heavily correlated as we would like. Imagine a hand that flopped the pure nuts 30% of the time and pure air 70% of the time. This hand would only have 30% equity preflop because it only wins 30% of the time, but would be an amazingly awesome hand. I've talked about this a bit in the past, and it can lead you to one of your biggest aha moments if you don't already completely understand this. But think about it. If you had a hand that flopped the pure nuts 30% of the time and pure air 70% of the time, that hand's going to have an extremely low amount of equity. Yet even though its equity is low, its expected value would be incredibly high, because when we flop the nuts, we're going to try to win a massive pot. When we flop air, we're going to be like, well, this hand sucks, it can never ever improve, and we're almost always going to just fold it when facing a bet, or check fold it if we have the opportunity to bet, and we don't think we can bet any 2 cards profitably. So despite having a low amount of equity, this hand would be absolutely amazing, because it never ever wastes its equity, and so since it never wastes its equity, you're always going to be able to make sure you have the right hand in the massive pots. It doesn't matter how strong the opponent's hand is, our hand is better when we want it to be. There's also no very quick starting point. We can defend against an open by 3-betting more and cold calling less, or by cold calling more and 3-betting less. How do we know which one's right? Well, we don't. We can do some math and ask some questions, such as, well, can 3-betting ace-queen preflop here make sense, or will his range be too strong when it calls? But we don't really have some awesome parameter to guide us. So we know we need to make the opener indifferent to opening the worst hand in his theoretically correct opening range, but we don't know exactly which way to do it. Cold calling preflop still. When designing a cold calling range from a theoretical perspective, we need to have a range that can't easily be exploited. This means we need a bunch of different types of hands in our cold calling range. Hands that can flop the nuts are total garbage. Pocket pairs, yeah, we need those. We need hands that usually can float or bluff raise the flop very successfully. Suited connectors and suited gappers. We need hands which can make medium strong hands at a high frequency, like high cards. If we refuse to play one of these types of hands, there's going to be something overall wrong with our range that allows our opponent to easily exploit us. We need a bunch of hands that can do a bunch of different things. None of the above hands is really better. They each do different things. I remember once thinking I could rank hands from strongest to weakest, and that's terrible. Since we can't just make a list of hands from strongest to weakest, it makes it much harder for us to know what to flat, fold, and 3-bet. Do not get in the habit of thinking there are some hands which are better than others. Sometimes it's so obvious you can go ahead and just roll with it, but for the most part, there's a lot of times, especially, once again, we're pre-flop, tons of different flops, tons of streets left to act, tons of stack depth. We need hands that can do different things, and they'll be good in different ways. Which types of hands we should put the most emphasis on will depend on positions and stack depth. Preflop hand types. Think about the following in terms of multi-way pots and stack depth. So, let's do an example. Pocket pairs. Pocket pairs make an awesome hand at a low frequency and a crap hand at a very high frequency, yet immediately tell us whether we have the best hand. So that, in a nutshell, is what pocket pairs do. They have a certain amount of equity, and when they flop the nuts, they're amazing because we know we have the best hand. But if a pocket pair was the best hand on the flop, like if we have pocket twos and the flop comes 8-7-4, it doesn't matter if our opponent has ace-queen, we're not winning the hand. So pocket pairs make awesome hands at low frequencies and crap hands at high frequencies. And they immediately tell us whether or not we're nutted, which is nice. So, when do you think these hands are going to be best? So, when are these good and when are they bad? Pause for a moment and think. It's a very easy question. When would you want pocket pairs? So, do you want them multi-way? Do you want them heads up? Do you want a lot of money behind, or do you want a little bit of money behind? Pause and think, and then unpause. Okay, so the answer is pretty easy. Multi-way pots are awesome, and you want stack depth. Because we just want the pot to be able to get as big as we can pretty much make it when we flop a set. Yes, I know there are exceptions. Look at the board texture to see how many oversets, there are relative to the number of players and figure out how many straights and flushes are possible. Do all that stuff, but for the most part, you want to be multi-way, and you want there to be a lot of stack depth so you can win a lot of money if you're going to take a flop, post-flop with pocket pairs. So now let's do suited connectors and gappers. These are much more challenging. They give us drawing hands at a very high frequency. I'm defining a drawing hand as a hand to 5 outs to 2 pairs or trips, flush draws, straight draws, 3 to flush and 3 to a straight, or some combination of the above two. So think about this for a minute. Once again, like how I just said, you could fold pocket twos on sort of an 8-7-4 board. Your opponent's going to make you fold me as ace-queen or queen-king usually. The same thing can happen when you flop the best hand with a pair that really needs to have 2 pairs or trips to feel confident about it. So, if if the flop comes queen 9-5 and you have 5-4 suited, you're not almost ever going to win at showdown with a pair of 5s there because the hand does not retain its equity well, and in order for you to know you have the best hand, you really need to hit the 2 pair or the trips. So think about it. When are these good? When are these bad? I will argue a lot of what you've been taught about these hands are wrong, and this is one of those things I feel quite passionately about. So get ready for a rant after you unpause in a second. So the drawing hands. If we flop a flush draw, a straight draw, a gut shot, or a pair, we really need to be either able to bluff raise them quite profitably, or we need to be able to get odds that we can call and see a turn or a river. Now, if we're playing multi-way, the problem with trying to float with a gut shot is we can get raised behind. The problem with trying to call with a weak flush draw is everyone sees when the flush gets there, and we're not going to get a lot of value. The problem with trying to bluff raise 3 to a flush and 3 to a straight is since there are so many players on the flop, that probably isn't strong enough hand quality to use as a bluff randomizer. Our standard for how strong a hand needs to be has gotten a lot higher. So in my opinion, while suited connectors and gappers can make fine hands multi-way if it's like 3 to the flop. I'm not saying don't ever use them at all. They are massively overrated multi-way. Stack depth sucks when you're multi-way because someone could easily c-bet, 10 or 9 big blinds into a 14 big blind pot. Your gut shot with 3 to flush isn't going to be able to float there. Even if you have a flush draw, not a backdoor flush draw, but a flush draw, it still might not be getting the implied odds you need because you're drawing to a relatively weak flush draw and everyone's going to see the flush got there. So these hands, they're great for floating and they're great for bluff raising, but that's not really what you're doing multi-way. Multi-way, I'm not really looking for a hand that can bluff raise and float super effectively. I'm just like, just give me the nuts or don't. I'm not looking to really go to war here. So these hands are still very good. They're useful in a lot of ways, but really think about it. And a lot of what you maybe have read, how these hands get amazingly good as you get multi-way and deep. Maybe that's true for like live poker where everyone's awful and people stack off over pairs, but that's definitely not going to be true where people make relatively large bets and are able to read the board texture very well like they are in a lot of online games. And another final easy one. So high cards. Hands like king, queen, and ace jack flop marginal hands at a high frequency. So if you're flopping marginal hands at a high frequency, pause for a moment and answer when are they going to be good. It should take you 3 seconds. And the answer, of course, is going to be, you're going to want these for like heads up pots when stack sizes are very, very shallow. Because if stack sizes are very, very shallow, I can be like, you know what? Like, let's imagine I'm playing a donkament and there's only 15 big blinds left. I'm fine with stacking off ace jack whenever I flop an ace or a jack. I'm fine with stacking off king queen whenever I flop a king or a queen. Whereas if I get really, really deep and I get multi-way, king queen off deep in multi-way is going to be like the crappiest possible hand. Anyone that can read board textures at all is going to be able to see if you can have a possible 2-pair, trips, or straight. It's not that hard to see pocket tens is not that good of a hand on an ace jack 10 board. So king queen off is not going to play well at all. It's going to be completely awful. Same deal with ace jack off. These hands are garbage if you're multi-way in deep. As you get heads up, they get a lot better. As stack sizes get shallow, they get a lot better. So where exactly you draw the line, of course, is going to depend on a whole bunch of factors, but get that general idea down when you're making your cold calling range. Example. Design a button versus cutoff cold calling range. It is impossible to tell if flatting a hand is plus EV since we always go post flop, assuming we don't get squeezed and have to fold, with a ton of stack depth and streets left to act. The truth is, we have no idea if flatting 9-7 suited in the button is plus EV versus the cutoff in theory. We can do the following. Make a guess as to what you think a cutoff opening range should be, and then how each remaining position should play against a cutoff open. We want to ask ourselves, how often is the cutoff 3-bet? If the cutoff's 3-bet like crazy, then obviously the cutoff's going to want to tighten its range because it doesn't like opening and having to fold. If the cutoff's almost never 3-bet, the cutoff can get away with opening incredibly wide, much wider than it should be able to in theory. How often is the cutoff flatted by the button? That's a big one, and we're about to go into that in just a second, but this is likely quite bad for the cutoff since the button only flats if calling is greater than 0 EV overall, and the button can get squeezed and is guaranteed to be in position. So if we're flatting in the button, we probably have a reasonably good hand because we risk being squeezed if we have to fold to a squeeze, so we want to be in quite a good spot if the blinds fold, or if we have a hand that can defend against a squeeze, then obviously we have a very good hand. So it's unlikely we're flatting many hands in the button that the cutoff's worst opening hand in his range doesn't do quite poorly against. So if the cutoff's worst opening hand is something like King 5 suited, then when we flatten the button, obviously that's quite bad for the cutoff. Even though there'll be dead money from the blinds, he has a very weak hand and he's out of position. How often is the big blind flatted by the big blind? Bad sentence. How often is the cutoff flatted by the big blind is what I meant to write. This likely isn't that bad for the cutoff. The big blind is flatting hoping just to lose less than 1 BB, since he's already posted that 1 BB in dead money, so the cutoff is still likely in a very reasonable spot, even with the weaker hands. This is especially true if the weaker hands in the cutoff's opening range really want to be in position, which is arguably true. If the weakest hand the cutoff opens is like King 5 suited or 10-7 suited, those hands do much better in position than out of position. So we need to think when we're designing the overall defending range. So I know the title says design a button versus cutoff cold calling range, but in order to do that, we need to know how every single position plays. We want to really take into account, like, how bad is it when the cutoff opened and got flatted by the button and the cutoff has the weakest hand in its range? Probably really bad. If the cutoff got flatted by the big blind, probably not as bad. If the cutoff gets 3-bet, then we know the cutoff lost its entire, open. So if the cutoff's opening the 3 or 3.5 big blinds, it loses everything. So we can use this information to overall design ranges that we think look reasonable. So let's do a cutoff flat and chat while we do it. Alright, so let's go ahead and get this started. So, as I mentioned before, if we aren't ever flatting any strong hands in the button against a cutoff open, we're going to be too vulnerable to being squeezed, and when we do flat a squeeze, we're going to be too vulnerable to being barreled post-flop, as well as we'll just whiff some boards. So because of that, we should cold call some combinations of aces and ace-king. That lets us hit king-high boards and very, very low boards a little bit more often. I don't know exactly how many we should be flatting. It's something we can't solve for, so I'm not going to deal with exactly worrying about the weight. I think you should be 3-betting them the majority of the time, especially if your 3-bet sizing is such that it makes your opponent flat out of position with hands like ace-queen. But just keep that in mind, you should be flatting some of these. Okay, so let's do the cold calling. So in general, I think you want to be 3-betting this range. Not probably that debatable there. Jacks probably aren't going to get enough value to 3-bet when you're in position, because your opponent's going to be a little bit more likely to 4-bet or fold. Having said that, if you are 3-betting very small, you can probably go ahead and start adding in some jacks. Not a big deal. So keep in mind, we are going to flat some aces and ace-king, even though I'm not showing it. Alright, so the flatting range. Cutoff versus button. Since the cutoff's range is much weaker than something like an under-the-gun open, hands like ace-10 suited, king-10 suited, queen-10 suited, jack-10 suited, they're going to be better, much better against a cutoff open than they will against an under-the-gun open. Whereas hands like 2s, 3s, and 4s, these hands are pretty much winning when they flop a set, no matter how strong the opponent's opening range is. So we might be using all of them here simply because it's cutoff versus button and we're going to be wide, but just keep that in mind that hands are going to change in strength based on how wide the opponent's opening. So, I would imagine, let's just start off with the more obvious hands. So I'm pretty much going to cold call with all these hands right here to start it off. These are all pretty standard. Oh no, sorry. These are all pretty standard hands right here. We got a bunch of our really good suited connectors, sort of our middle suited connectors, our high suited cards, and then just our good, sort of top pair hands. Obviously, a hand like king queen off or ace jack off is much better here because the cutoff's opening hands like ace 10 off. All of his suited aces, most of his suited kings, and hands like king jack off. So whereas king queen off and ace jack off are probably very bad against an under the gun open, remember how we talked about what cold calling hands make sense in what spots, they're probably quite good here. Ace 10 off, king jack off, still probably not quite strong enough to call. And we want to mix this range so we have around the right amount of pocket pairs, suited connectors, suited high cards. If you look right here, since king, queen, ace, queen off, and ace, jack off all make up 12 combos each, you add in the suited ones, we get to 16 combos. We have a lot of really high cards here, so I would probably add in more suited connectors and suited gappers. Once you get to the point where the range starts looking relatively reasonable, at a glance, I think something like this looks pretty good. Then you want to finish out the rest of the ranges, and then make sure you're defending overall enough based on how wide the player's opening. So here I'm assuming like a 3 or 3.5 open. Both those aren't going to change this range very drastically. So once you've made all the ranges sort of doing like quickly what makes sense, then you can start adjusting the ranges if you find out you're defending too much or too little. So off the top of my head, and I've done this several times before even though I don't have this memorized, this looks around right, especially once you start adding in the aces and the ace-king off, which protect you a little bit more against squeezes. So that would be my cutoff first button start. And I forgot to add in jacks. So this looks like a pretty reasonable flatting range. It really tries to abuse the power of position, and once you add in some aces and ace-king, it does get decently, strong that it can defend against squeezes pretty well. So it looks like a reasonable estimate, a really good starting point, and that's fine. We'll roll with that. So now let's move on to defending from the small blind and the big blind. Okay, so the small blind is very complex, and approaching it from a theoretical perspective, there's a lot of problems with it, which I'm going to try to discuss relatively briefly now. The first is, we know we always have to make the most profitable decision at every single point with our hand in theory. The problem with slow playing a very strong hand from the small blind is there's only one person left that can squeeze us, and he's often not going to squeeze, he's often going to flat and put us out of position multi-way. That's not how it was when we were flatting the button. There were two people left who could squeeze, and they would often want to squeeze because they were out of position, and even if they didn't, we got to take the flop in position multi-way. So because of that, it becomes very, very difficult to slow play strong hands in the small blind. Does that mean we should never be slow playing strong hands? Maybe not. it's very, very hard to tell, because if we never slow play strong hands, then when we do get squeezed from the big blind, maybe it's possible we should just re-squeeze jam with a range that looks something like this. There's not a lot of ways our opponent can exploit this. Even though our range is very much capped, if we re-squeeze jam here, our opponent had to have not been bluffing. Otherwise, he gets, even if we're re-squeeze jamming this range, if our opponent 3-bet bluffed 10-8 suited, even if he knows we're capped, what can he really do? Nothing. So that's one possible solution. The other is to just say, well, hey, you know what? If we flat here, the big blind can only squeeze so much, or else we can start exploiting him because we think he's bluffing too much. And then the cutoff will start being able to flat a lot in position, because when the big blind squeezes, if he's squeezing very, very aggressively, the cutoff will start defending very, very aggressively. So then we kind of just push the responsibility of defending onto the cutoff and leave the small blind alone. So this is similar to the ace-king 4-bet topic. It's one where if I wanted to, I probably could really make like 20 or 30 minutes of talk about just whether or not we should slow play strong hands in the small blind, exactly what our range should look like. It's probably not a reasonable or worthwhile thing for me to do, so just be aware of how complex it is, and just also be aware that in practice, I would not recommend slow playing big hands in the small blind. You get out of position too much and you don't get squeezed enough, so it's probably not a good idea unless you know your opponent's super, super squeeze happy. What we do know is, since we are out of position when we squeeze in the small blind, our opponent's going to defend more by flatting, because he's going to want to use his positional advantage in the cutoff. So that means now I would start 3-betting hands like jacks and ace-queen suited against most opponents. So now our 3-betting range is going to look something like this. I'm going to go ahead and write that down. 3-bet from small blind, 3.3%. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and this goes back to the first time I tried to make a preflop series, where I said something like, hey, have 60% bluffs and have 40% 3-bets when you 3-bet. And that's still a really good rule. As things get more complex, though, and we get into flatting 4-bets out of position, and we also start really taking into account a few other important factors, that is still a really, really good estimate, I think, but it's not as precise as it could be. So, for example, right here, when we're in the small blind, since cold calling in the small blind sucks so much, we're probably going to be able to use better 3-bet bluffs than we would be able to otherwise. And what I mean by that is, let's say if you're in the big blind and the cutoff opens, you might consider flatting with a hand like 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, or 8-7 suited, because you know you close the action and you get a bigger discount since there's more dead money. Here, since you're in the small blind, those hands probably aren't good enough to flat, so instead you 3-bet bluff them. But since we're 3-bet bluffing better hands, that means if our opponent defends by calling, we're going to be in better shape than we otherwise would. Because if we 3-bet a similar value range from the big blind, and we will 3-bet a very similar value range as to this range right here, aces to jacks, ace-queen suited, and ace-king, but our bluffs are weaker. Here our bluffs are stronger, so we can probably bluff a little bit more. Okay, so we're going to add in a bunch of 3-bet bluffs to this, but right now let's first start off with cold calling. Hard to say. I would recommend cold calling something like this. And I'm not thrilled about it. All the problems that I just talked about with the 3-betting range and the small blind also are going to apply to the cold calling range. I don't like having our cold calling range kind of relatively capped as a lot of marginal hands out of position when there's still a good amount of stack depth. They're capped reasonably strong. The cutoff's opening range is relatively weak, so it's nice that we hit a lot of top pair good kicker, although we don't have a lot of overpairs and a lot of sets, so we are still sort of capped. This range definitely has its problems, but there doesn't really seem like a great way to improve it. A lot of the ways we could improve it in other spots, slow playing big hands, aren't really an option here. So this is what I would sort of use as like sort of a go-to range, but even then you probably could take, actually I don't even know if I usually call with Jack-10 suited, it's close. So something like this seems reasonable, but it's hard to say exactly. So I'm going to write this down, keeping in mind how hard this range is to really do. Cold call, 6.5%. Okay, so now we need to do the 3-betting range. Since we are cold calling with these hands, we can 3-bet bluff some awesome hands. So that's the one neato thing about the small blind. So boom. So those are some damn quality bluffs right there, which is really, really great. Add in those. And then what else do I want? Maybe just ace-5 or ace-4 suited, queen-9, queen-9 suited for good measure. Something like this. This is probably a little bit too bluff happy, so maybe we can take take out the ace-5 and ace-4 suited. But something like this seems very reasonable. So we are able to, since we aren't able to flatten the small blind effectively, at least we're able to 3-bet very aggressively and very effectively. This is something that is far from provable, but it's something to me that makes a bunch of sense, and feel free to give me your comments on it in the forums after I talk about it for just a minute. So now we're at the end of the video, but only kinda. We are out of time, and I don't want to ramble about preflop ranges or make concepts out to be more simple than they are. So there's both good things and bad things when I try to sort of do stuff on the spot. On one hand, if I'm actually trying to make ranges, if I'm randomly generating flops, it gives you a much more realistic idea for how someone actually thinks and for how they try to come up with and solve problems than if I just, make all the slides ahead of time where I'm just reading off a slide. So some people really like that. Some people probably don't like it as much. It's hard to tell when I'm rambling about something or when I'm actually giving a bunch of really good information, and it probably changes from person to person. So for example, I don't want to just brush by the fact that whether or not you should flat ace-king off to a 4-bet out of position is such a complicated issue, but I don't also want to spend a bunch of time on it because it's not something that's incredibly important. The same thing applies when flatting in the small blind against a cutoff open. There's a whole ton of problems with it, and I could go into detail on all of them, but it's not probably worth the time, and it would make for some really boring slides if I tried to write them all out. So I'm going to try to do something I've never done before and see how this works. Rather than spend another hour on this video, 5 weeks after this video is released, I will spend at least 1 hour answering any questions I see in the forums and responding to any of your preflop ranges. If a ton of people try to take me up on this offer, I will put more emphasis on people who post defending ranges versus the cutoff, since that's just what we focused on. That's what we just focused on. So I have no idea how many people are going to want to do this. There could be a bunch of players that really want preflop help, and I get a bunch of posts and I try to help only a little bit on each one, or it could be if you make a post, you're one of 2 people who do, and you both get a bunch of help. I will spend at least 1 hour doing this. I will run math on it. I will explain to you why I think the range is good, what's bad about it. I have my own ranges, which I'll be able to compare to very, very quickly and explain, why I think you're right or why I think you're wrong for using a specific hand. So at least 1 hour on that, 5 weeks after this video is released. And I will also focus on people who put more time in effectively organizing their question and post. So let me know what opening size you're assuming, and let me know any math you've already done, such as the math comes out to be that middle position is 3-bet a total of 17%. That will let me answer your question more quickly and go into more detail on other aspects. So if you want to see what a complete cutoff range or a complete defending range looks like from the button, small blind, and big blind against a cutoff open, make your best crack at it, post it, and post the information with it, and I will explain what I think's good, what I think's bad, or how mine is different. Likewise, if you're already good on the button and cutoff play, because that's what we focused on, and you want to talk more about like under the gun stuff, that's fine as well. Do some work on it, post it, and I will spend some time, specifically focusing on your problem. And the more organized you are, the more time I'll spend on your post. So, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. I actually look forward to reading the ranges and stuff you guys post, and I will see you guys soon.